I mean, I'm very focused on the military balance because I think at the end of the day, the Chinese are going to have to use military force to bring other countries to heel. But the Chinese really believe in political warfare and sort of, I don't want to mind control, like, kind of those, silver helmet sort of thing, but trying to shape people's understanding of what is reality and what's permissible. And if you have the world's largest company and its largest technology company working for you, I mean, that tells you so much about the leverage they have.
Yeah.
That they will be compliant.
Hello, Rebels. Welcome to the Daily California. It's Friday, December the 2nd. Our Friday conversations today, really great, really important. And they're connected because, as we all have been seeing in the news, there's been a lot going on in China this week, both in terms of the protests that have happened in China against Xi Jingping's insane zero COVID policy. What does that mean for the future of the pro-democracy, pro-freedom movement in China? What does it mean for us here in America, particularly when you look at the behavior of companies like Apple? What does it mean for our future preparedness for any kind of military aggression from China, the future of Xi Jinping? Does this mean he's going to be weakened in his grip on power? Is he going to stay in power? Who knows? I'll tell you who knows. Elbridge Colby, who is brilliant. You've met him on this show before, and he joins us to break down exactly what we should be thinking about those protests in China. But before that, another set of protests that I've been very, very engaged in, and I'm really, really moved by, which are the protests that are going on in Iran. Of course, they were in the spotlight this week because of the World Cup and the Iranian soccer team. We'll all be happy that the Iranian team lost to the US. Of course, we support our team, but I think we can all be incredibly impressed by the bravery shown by the Iranian soccer team in the way that they stood up for the protests that are happening in their country by refusing to sing the anthem of the Islamic Republic that first time they appeared in the World Cup. So again, it focused our attention on what's going on in Iran. And so I wanted to really understand that. Again, whether it means that this time these protests in Iran might actually lead to the kind of change that we want to see. So we have someone right now joining us, Lisa Daftari, who is an absolutely brilliant chronicler of everything that's been going on in Iran. She's Iranian herself, runs a news organization that's really focused on this, and I think you'll enjoy this conversation. Lisa, it's so great to see you today. I've been dying to talk to you about this because what's been going on in Iran, I've just felt so emotionally engaged in ever since we saw this recent round of protests. But it goes back all the way to the Green Revolution, which, of course, never turned into a revolution. I remember being involved in politics back then in the UK, and I was just so disappointed and angry, actually, that the West did so little, I thought, to support the Iranian people then. And I feel like it's sort of heading that way now. Again, the incredible bravery we're seeing in Iran ever since this terrible story, Mahsa Amini, when was it, in September, died in jail as a result of the brutality of the religious police. That's what everyone assumes. They, of course, deny it, for not wearing her hijab properly. I mean, it's just, and then ever since then, it's just not stopped. The protests are not stopping. Of course, we're all reminded of it this week because of the World Cup. And again, I thought the incredible bravery of the soccer team, who in the first time they appeared in the World Cup, refusing to sing the anthem, which many Iranians have said to me is not our anthem. It's not the national anthem. It's the anthem of the the Islamic Republic, which they consider not to be anything other than an occupying force. So, that was really brave. There's so much that's going on, and I feel like we're not supporting the people of Iran enough. You write about this. You're Iranian yourself. I'd love to just give you some time to lay out exactly what you think, put this in context, and talk about the situation in Iran and what we can be doing, what we should be doing, what we've got wrong, and all the rest of it. Over to you.
Sure. Well, thank you, Steve. Thank you for covering this. I think that is first and foremost. A lot of Iranians reach out to us daily saying, don't leave us alone. That's the only thing we can offer them is to cover their stories and not let this kind of escape the mainstream media spotlight, which it has. And it has also escaped the White House podium, and very unfortunately, as you said, as well as the European parliaments, and the list goes on. The Iranian people have made their story very clear, especially this time around. And you very accurately pointed to the 2009 Green Revolution. That was the last time we saw a very bold movement from the Iranian people. It was said that it was over a fraudulent election, but it turned into what we're seeing now, which was a call for the entire regime to be removed. And it was not covered, whether it was because President Obama did not want to pursue that foreign policy or because Michael Jackson ended up dying in the middle of all of that. So coverage went to his death. But regardless, the Iranian people did not have it in the cards for them. Over 43 years, we've seen many, many protests. And each time we ask, well, will this be the one that ultimately overthrows this regime? Well, if there was ever a chance for the Iranian people to do that, this is that time. The Iranian people have never been as united, both inside and outside in Iran, and as clear in their messaging. In previous uprisings, we saw various catalysts, right? So we saw the egg protest, which was over the price of eggs. We saw the fraudulent election of 2009. We saw the university protests in 1999. We saw the bazaar protest just a couple of years ago. And each time it was just kind of diminished as a protest over that catalyst. But yet, this time around, although the catalyst was the 22-year-old that you refer to, Mahsa Amini, who was taken into custody because just a bit of her hair was showing in the front as she was visiting relatives in Tehran. She was taken into custody by the so-called morality police. She was beaten, slipped into a coma, and then passed away. She became that proverbial straw that broke the camel's back, and people just went into this revolution mode very quickly. And all throughout the world, Iranians are supporting, the expat Iranians are supporting the Iranians back at home. And really, it's either you're with us or you're not with us. There are not different camps. This is not tied to any leader in specific. It's not tied to any political group or any ethnicity or any religion or town or city. In 2009, it was also called the Tehran Revolution because mostly you saw those cool kids coming out, right, with the gel in their hair and designer clothing. Yeah. And that was their movement. This time around, you're seeing protests in the smallest provinces, the clerical provinces, places like Qom that are where all the madrasas and the mosques are. You're seeing protests on the streets. And the slogans tell us everything we need to know about this movement. Death to the dictator. And there's so many others. They're all obviously in Persian and very sweet and they rhyme, but they're also very clear and to the point. A lot of them are using profanity on the streets. A lot of them are using violence. Some of these Basiji forces that have been unleashed to kill and beat and arrest these protesters have actually been killed by the protesters themselves. But Steve, you have to understand how badly they want this. They do not have weapons. They do not have any means of true organization other than trying to get on the internet through proxy servers because their internet is shut down. But they are trying to do this as best as possible. And that desire is very obvious on all the streets of Iran.
Thank you for that, for laying that out. Let me ask a few follow-up questions. First of all, am I right? I get a sense that this is more enduring. It's now 2 months plus. Is the intensity there? I mean, we see the pictures from time to time. Is it diminishing, growing roughly at the same level? And am I right to get this sense that it's sort of going on for longer than previous attempts to overthrow the regime?
Right, absolutely right to make that assessment that this, the perseverance is nothing like what we have seen before. And maybe that is because it has entered into so many different sectors of society. Right. So you have seen protests on the school campuses, even high school campuses. It's been called a women's movement. So you see a lot of women burning their hijabs and gathering, but it's also a movement for everyone. You're seeing people of all ages, a lot of young people out on the streets. But I think one of the reasons it has endured is because there is no way to go back. When you see your government go into your finest universities, let me make the comparison of going into an MIT or a Harvard and killing off the best and brightest, basically killing off the future. How can you ever accept that government as yours?
What do you
How
mean?
can you ever accept that they are the ones to lead you into the future? So these young people, there's a lot to it. And if I would just connect a few more dots for you, these young people never grew up under the Shah of Iran, which was over 43 years ago, like myself. We grew up with stories about how wonderful, what a utopia Iran was in the 70s. And because they grew up with their parents' and grandparents' stories, these young people are almost, gaining revenge for something they never lived through, but
Right.
they have a faux nostalgia for something that they have heard through their parents' stories. So when they watch that 15-year-old getting shot on the street because he's cheering for soccer, or a 22-year-old who's just driving in his car and honking in support of the protesters he sees around him and he gets shot to death, how can they ever go back? So there is so much fuel here. There is so much for them to fight for, and that is why we're seeing this endure for as long as it has.
I mean, let's use the word killing. I mean, let's just sort of get the scale of it and understand the brutality of it. I mean, I put up on my Fox show on Sunday night an image that someone had tweeted, which was here are some, and I think the caption, here are some of the children that have been killed just in the last few weeks. And it was about sort of, dozens and dozens of children, the faces of these children. Right. I mean, what is the scale? What is going on in terms of the killings?
Right, and I wish we had a number. There's no way to get a death toll. And 3 years ago they went, they called it Bloody November. They went around on a killing spree, and the number that was released by many rights organizations on the UN was 1,500. And I assure you, Steve, that number is much higher. This time around, they have used the number 300 to 400. Just this week, they released that number. I assure you it is much higher than that. When you just hear about all the different anecdotes, when you hear about the massacres that took place, mostly in Kurdish areas, the massacre that took place at Sharif University in only the first few weeks of the protests, when you think about that and the fact that
just stop there. Just stop on that. You talked about going into the universities and killing off the best and the brightest. Just to expand on that a little bit, that particular university and what we see. What's going on? I think just give us a flavour of it, for those who haven't been following the reports as closely as you have.
Sure. This is Sharif University is like the MIT or Harvard of Iran in Tehran. They started peaceful protests, and the forces came in. They shut the university gates and the dorm doors so that the students would not be able to escape. You had students hiding up on the rooftop. You have it's just a horrific scene. And then eyewitnesses said that they put many of the students, they rounded them up in these white vans and they took them to an undisclosed location. We don't know what happened to these kids. We don't know. Very shortly thereafter, you had the fire at Evin prison, where all of these prisoners, or these protesters rather, were taken to prison. So it's my point being that it's very difficult to track what happens to these people once a peaceful protester who gets detained may never go home again. And this university is something that I always bring up, because again, it shows the fixation on killing people who are smart and bright. And you think about, they're the ones who are going to go off and make the research and inventions and do, wonderful things in this world. It's mainly a science and math school. So you can think about what kind of students go there. And if you think that the regime forces would do this to make an example out of this best university so that other universities don't follow. But in fact, Steve, in the 48 hours after that attack, there were dozens and dozens of universities across Iran where protests sprung up. People are coming out onto the streets. The bravery of the Iranian people is something I have never seen before in any of the world movements that I have covered in the last almost 2 decades. So it is tremendous to follow this
amazing.
And to see how even families, when they watch their neighbor's child get murdered for peacefully protesting, but then allowing their children to go out the next day again and again and again. It's truly remarkable how deep this fight is.
Wow, that's really amazing. I mean, it's just it's enraging, but also inspiring. It's all these emotions. I feel so emotional about it. I think that the thing that is so striking about it, exactly as you say, is that the whole point of the brutality is intimidation, is to say, look what happens to you if you do this. And the Iranian people are not being intimidated.
Right, exactly right. And, they have tried to do this for 43 years, right, to make an example out of people. That's what they tried to do with Mahsa Amini, right, the young girl who's taken into custody. And you'd think, for what? For showing some of her hair? They wanted to make an example out of her. You cannot dress this way. You need to dress in a way that's Sharia law compliant.
Yeah.
And they want to make an example out of every one of these young people, but they're not going anywhere. And that's really the question that's going to come up is, what will it take for this movement to reach the next level if they do not get that support from the White House, or if they do not get that support from the international community?
Yeah.
They do not have weapons. They don't have a way of escalating to a point where they can truly turn this into the revolution that they desire.
Right. Let's get to that at the end. On the way there, as part of sort of understanding that, could you explain a little bit about, we keep talking about they and the regime. Could you just unpack a little bit what that means? Because it's for those, again, who aren't so familiar with the way the current, the Islamic Republic works. We hear about the morality police, we hear the Ayatollah, we hear the sort of there are elections. There's a sort of government that's not religious. How does it all fit together? Who's really driving this unbelievably brutal repression?
Right. It's a system, right? It's a government. It's a theocracy. So in 1979, the Shah of Iran, he was a monarch, he was a king, was toppled, and this government came in under Ayatollah Khomeini at the time. He brought in a theocracy that was infallible. You could not question this government because it was run by Islam. Very quickly, they had women cover up from, and again, let me make that juxtaposition. In the 70s, you had women running around with tank tops and miniskirts, and all of a sudden, that same society was now told that they must cover their hair, must cover their arms, have to wear some sort of overcoat to not show their hips, and very quickly, turned it into a society in which people lived double lives. In order to have alcoholic beverages, you had to get it from the, an underground society, or where you knew where you were going to get it from. If you had a party, you had to pay off the security forces because music is not allowed, dancing is not allowed, commingling with the both genders not allowed. You cannot be seen with your significant other in public, let alone holding hands or kissing. If you get pulled over by the police and you're in the car with your significant other, you have to probably say, this is my sister or brother. Then you'd have to show documentation. There's a lot to it. In the court of law, the worth of a woman is half that of a man. So if you have one male witness, you will need two female witnesses to equal that testimony. A woman cannot file for divorce. Her husband will have to file for divorce. And even when he does so, he will get full custody of the children. Women are unlikely to get divorces for that reason. And the list goes on and on. So it is a society that is run by Sharia law. The supreme leader, who is now Khamenei, who you may hear his name a lot in the protests on the streets, he is the supreme leader. There's also a president right now. He is a very harsh president who was, quote unquote, elected in the most recent presidential election. He is Ibrahim Raisi, who is called the butcher of Iran because he was in the judiciary in the 80s, and because he has so much blood on his hands of innocent Iranian young people, they call him the butcher. And now he is the president. And then there are different arms. You have the Revolutionary Guard arms. That's a paramilitary organization. They're the ones who do all the dirty work to make sure that this regime stays in power. They're the ones who are running the show in Syria. And the regime itself is funding many proxy terrorist organizations ever since they came into power in 1979 in order to make sure that not only they stay in power in Iran, but that in the region they are the big honcho, right? So they're supporting Hamas, they're supporting Hezbollah in Lebanon. Now they're supporting the Houthis in Yemen. They are supporting the insurgencies in Iraq. They are propping up Bashar al-Assad's regime in Syria. And they're the number one state sponsor of terrorism. So when I connect all these dots for you, and then I come around and say, for the last 8 years, well, we're beginning with President Obama, I should say, they have been pining to give billions of dollars, and they did, to this same regime that I just outlined for you, to make a deal with them, normalize relations with them. And here you have not one good reason that this regime should ever be normalized or maintain its power. Not for the people of Iran, not for the people of the region, and it's certainly not for the Western world's national security and assets in the region as well.
Again, brilliant. Thank you for explaining that so clearly. So let's just turn to the final and in many ways the most important part, which is, okay, what should we be doing to help this incipient revolution?
Right. So as the average person, what you can be doing is sharing their stories, keeping this in the spotlight. Don't rely on the mainstream media, although some of them have done a decent job here and there, Fox News being one of them, Newsmax another one. CNN here and there has started covering more and more, but what they need more. So they rely on, journalists like you and I who are taking time to tell their stories, post it on social media. It doesn't matter if you have 10 followers or 100 or 1 million, tell their stories. If you have local, law enforcement and legislatures that can basically condemn, there have been many bills in California. I know at Newport Beach, they had an issue with not pushing forward a bill that was going to condemn the regime. In Beverly Hills, I know that they did pass a bill that condemns the regime. It seems like local politics don't matter in these cases. They absolutely do. They raise awareness and they push it to the top. That will then go to our representatives in Congress and certainly in the Senate and wherever else you can write a note to, you can write an email to. Make sure you do so. This is an important story. And unfortunately, we have an administration right now that plays pick and choose buffet when it comes to human rights. Okay. If we are truly going to stand behind human rights, if we're going to stand behind protecting our assets and curbing terrorism, what happened to the war on terror? The first place to start is with the regime in Iran. And we have the best partner in that endeavor, and that's 80 million people in Iran who are telling us they will help us get rid of this regime. Okay. So, it's obviously something to support. I'm a journalist. I'm also a political commentator, and I work in both capacities. But in this case, there are not two sides to this story. I know in Western journalism, we believe, well, what's the other side? There is no other side. This is the battle between good and evil. Yes. And the Iranian people deserve a chance. They deserve for us to tell their stories of these teenagers being brutally murdered on the streets, or a young girl, 15 years old, getting killed at school because she refused to sing the Islamic Republic's anthem. I mean, these are real stories that are happening in the year 2022. And if we have a chance to raise awareness about them, it's a significant move that we can make in helping them.
So what about the policy aspects in terms of what the U.S. administration should be doing? I've got two questions here. One is, are they still pursuing the Iran nuclear deal, or have even they admitted that that's just, they got to drop that? Right. I haven't followed that. And secondly, the two things that you mentioned that the brave people need are weapons and better internet access so they can organize. Do you, just to be really specific, do you think somehow we should be providing weapons to them directly or indirectly? And secondly, should we be somehow trying to provide them with internet access? So take the Iran deal, is that dead? Right. Or are they still trying to keep it alive? And secondly, weapons and internet.
All right. So if we start from the top, the Iran deal was dead, meaning before this movement started, there were so many of these inconvenient truths that came about from each time they would meet in Vienna, right? So each time we would hear, well, we're close, but we haven't quite, we have some differences that we can't work out. That's because the Iran regime was asking for everything in the kitchen sink, and they were not able to work out a deal. Mm-hmm. Now, in this interim, this movement started in Iran. There's a lot of pressure for them not to move forward with this, with the nuclear deal. Mm-hmm. And suddenly you had, on the one hand, Rob Malley, who is the envoy. He's the guy who is entrusted from the U.S. perspective to work out the Iran deal. He came out and said, we're not going to pursue a policy of regime change when it comes to Iran. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, they also came out and said, we're going to step away and take a hiatus from the Iran deal. So on the one hand, they have pivoted away from that policy of pursuing very urgently a nuclear deal because of everything going on. But on the other hand, they have stopped short of supporting the revolution the way that they should and the Iranian people would like them to. So there's still a lot of pressure on the White House to say more, to do more, to speak out more
even the sort
in
of
supporting the people of Iran.
Sorry, and I noticed that Obama has now said that he thinks he made a mistake in 2009 in not supporting the Green Revolution, which I thought was an interesting...
Very interesting. It's interesting that he would come out and say that to begin with, A. B, the timing all of this. Why would you come out now and say it? You do not want to be on the wrong side of history, perhaps? And C, a lot of people say, well, if this Biden administration's foreign policy is crafted after the Obama administration, maybe he can have a word with his pal Joe Biden and talk him into not making the same mistake this time around. Okay, so just
on the impact of so if we could somehow engineer through Obama or Democrat senators, whoever, put pressure on Biden, if the Biden administration simply in terms of its public position, clearly sided with the people on the streets, would that symbolic support make a difference?
Absolutely. And if the White House thinks, if Biden thinks that him supporting the movement, if their calculation is that, well, they're going to blame it on us for incitement, they're doing that anyway. Right. Every single day, the Iranian press, and I'm reading it in Persian, they are blaming Israel and the United States for incitement, for anti-regime propaganda, for helping and inciting the movement that's currently going on the ground. So if they're being blamed for it anyway, why not give the people that support? If it's going to matter, if it's going to be a significant piece in this movement.
And then finally, could you address the weapons and internet point? I mean, is there anything practical we could do there, or would that be a step too far?
Look, Steve, if they decide to support this movement, our administration has a long list of tools and resources that they can provide anyone to do anything. And because of this freedom movement, we have, every reason to at least provide internet, at least provide the resources. But the first thing is to not stand in their way, to not go back into pursuing a nuclear deal. Just don't stand in their way. If they would take a position on regime change, that would be fabulous. The Iranian people would benefit greatly from that positioning. And lastly, if they would begin to decide to provide resources for the Iranian people, well, then they know what to do at that point in order to help them organize, help them get online, help them, continue and endure. We have to get money to these people who are on strike. The truck drivers are on strike. Many different oil workers, the petro workers are on strike. We got to get them paid. So the money that you want to give to the regime, you have to give to these strikers if you truly want them to continue to strike in order to make a dent in the oil sales and economy of the regime. That's what needs to be done. So there's a lot of things that can be done, but the Biden administration has to decide that they want to make those changes.
Yeah, and then so the final point is this. Tell me if this is going too far and is it sort of, we've been pushing into territory which is kind of reckless. Obviously, massive support for the what's going on in Ukraine to support the Ukrainian people resisting the Russian invasion. Would you make an analogy that actually within Iran, this is, intervening more directly wouldn't be intervening in the internal affairs of another country, but because actually the Islamic regime is the equivalent of an invading force, just as the Russians are in Ukraine, or is that pushing it too far?
Absolutely. That's a wonderful question. I've said this on interviews before. I've always said if we're supporting the Ukraine because of a Russian invasion, well, this invasion of Iran began 43 years ago, and that's the invasion that we need to focus on because it affects us more directly with the money that's going into terrorism in instability in the region. They don't just have Iranian blood on their hands. This regime has American blood on its hands as well. So it's something to focus on, and it's really that this administration needs to do a full pivot away from their status quo, this foreign policy regarding Iran. They have to look at the facts, they have to look at the people and reassess. Whatever handbook they inherited from the Obama administration is outdated, and they need to truly assess the situation to see what would be best for the region, for the people of Iran, and of course, American assets in that part of the world as well.
Lisa, thank you so much. That was absolutely brilliant. Where can people follow your work and keep up to date with what's going on?
You can go to our website, foreigndesknews.com. We put out a daily top 10 email 5 days a week that you can get for free and subscribe there. You can also find us on social media, either under Lisa Daftari or the Foreign Desk, and we post everything on social as well.
Fantastic. Great to see you. Really appreciate it.
Of course. Thank you.
So that was Iran. Now let's turn to China. The protests, as I mentioned at the top of the show, that have really come under the spotlight against Xi Jinping's zero COVID policy. What does it all mean? What does it mean for now and in the future? Let's welcome Elbridge Colby to help us break it all down. So, Elbridge, every time anything happens in China, that there's a glimmer of hope in terms of, the pro-freedom, pro-democracy movement. We've seen these protests erupt in the last few days, but they seem to be dampening down in response to, pretty aggressive use of force by the regime. But every time we see this, we get very excited and think, well, is this the moment? Is this the moment that there's a real challenge to the regime? There's a real challenge to Xi Jinping's rule. What's your assessment? How serious is this? How excited should we be?
Well, first and foremost, I think we really have to sympathize and applaud. People who are exhibiting tremendous courage. To take a stand against the Chinese Communist Party and Xi Jinping. It's really extraordinary after watching what's happened in Hong Kong. I don't want to be always the skunk at the party, sort of the raining on the parade, but I am pessimistic, I have to say. I hope to be proved wrong. But a couple of things. The Chinese Communist Party appears to have developed a sort of surveillance and oppression state that, Beria and, the Stalin could only have dreamed of. It's it's potentially less lethal. It can be probably, I'm sure, quite lethal if they get to that point, but it's much more efficient. It's kind of the realization of the panopticon. You've seen stuff like, yeah, sure, cameras, facial recognition, AI, seeing everything you're doing on your phone. But there was a report recently that in Tibet, they're using the 23andMe equivalent, the spitting your DNA that be able to track you and understand and make predictions about your behavior. So, and the other thing is that Xi Jinping has made a special study of not ending up like the Soviets. So,
right.
The nice guy in this story is Deng Xiaoping, who murdered hundreds of thousands of people in Tiananmen Square, and Xi Jinping's nastier. So, unfortunately, I think we should hope for the best, prepare for the worst.
Yes. Because, it does seem, when was it? We're going back to the process. Was it? We're speaking on Wednesday. People will be hearing this for the first time on Friday, the 2nd of December. We're speaking on Wednesday, the 30th. And so to, put that in the context of this week, it was the weekend that these protests started. Was it Saturday?
Yeah, I think so. Exactly. It was over the weekend. I think that's right.
But already, and it was a pretty kind of, striking weekend. I opened my Fox News show with it on Sunday night. You had these amazing, sound and video of protesters, saying, specifically targeting Xi Jinping and the ruling Communist Party. Really stunning. But already, by the middle of the week, it feels like they've got a handle on it in terms of just tamping it down. Is that right? Is there anything still going on? By the end of the week, do you think it will be completely eliminated?
It's hard to know. One thing to bear in mind is there's a ton of incidents or kind of protests that go on in China that are reported, many that I'm sure are not reported. But the CCP seems to have developed a very efficient process and effective process to keep it sort of under wraps. And I'm just not seeing the kind of indicators, and again, maybe there are people who are seeing it more clearly, or I'm sure seeing farther in there, but Xi Jinping is kind of proceeding with business as usual. The reporting now is that it's started to decline. On the other hand, what the proximate cause of this is the insanity of the COVID lockdowns in the PRC. Now, it appears the Chinese might be, at least in a sort of federal way, quote unquote, liberalizing some of these COVID restrictions, not the right word, but, loosening some of these COVID restrictions. Mm-hmm. So they may be trying to let a little bit of air out of the tire, or whatever, you just pick your metaphor. I would expect there to continue to be concerns about COVID and these kinds of things, or the COVID lockdowns. What I imagine is not going to happen is that you're going to see widespread, coordinated sort of efforts that directly challenge the political authority. And the actions by, for instance, Apple pulling out the airdrop function, that's a good way of doing it, where they've complied, it appears, with the PRC to say, we're going to make it a lot harder for people to self-organize.
Yes. I want to get to Apple specifically in a minute, but I just want to keep going down the path of what what might happen here, and flipping to the zero COVID policy. That's exactly where I was going to go next with this, which is, do you think that therefore, okay, let's put it this way: what are the chances of that policy being the thing that undermines Xi Jinping's grip on power? I mean, he's just got this president for life thing at the do they call it the party congress?
Yeah.
The meeting.
Shorthand.
And suddenly, and is it possible that actually there's an internal threat from the kind of higher levels of the party? You think this is crazy. We can't keep going on like this. Our growth is down. We're a laughing stock in the world. It's actually doing the opposite of what Xi Jinping wants, which is this greater China. People can see that our vaccine doesn't work. The policy's a mess, etc., etc. And then suddenly there's a move against him internally. Is that possible?
I think that is exactly it. That's the most plausible thing, which is, a strong authoritarian system. It looks placid until it breaks apart, but it has a brittle element to it where, sometimes the leader himself, and I think that's one of the lessons of Gorbachev, doesn't even appreciate how vulnerable it can be. And especially because I'm sure there are a ton of people. In fact, I think it's fair to say we know that there are a ton of people in China who hate Xi Jinping's guts, and not just people out in Xinjiang, but people at the center of power who've been purged. I mean, Hu Jintao and all of Hu Jintao's proteges, who are apparently, from the lineage, the political lineage of Deng Xiaoping. These are not nice people necessarily, but they hate Xi Jinping's guts. And I think that it's not just the COVID element, which is, the crazy sort of strictures on people. People literally burning to death in buildings, which was shared. I'm sure it's been sort of censored now, but also the economic ramifications, right? That's a huge element where China's looking like it's going to go into a recession. And this is testing something that, yes, Xi Jinping has consolidated power, but ever since the reform and opening process going back to the 70s and 80s, people talk about this as a deal. It's not formalized as a deal, but Chinese people who 50, 60 years ago were, the Great Leap Forward, there was mass famine, and now we're living at the forefront of human development. And now there's a COVID thing and things aren't growing. And apparently youth unemployment in China is up to near 20%. So I do think this is a dangerous period for Xi Jinping. I'm just not super optimistic because I think the guy is prepared and super ruthless and has purged his political opponents. So again, hope for the best, prepare for the worst.
Yes, it was Hu Jintao. Was that the guy? I think it was. When he was shuffled off the stage. Yeah. That was such a fascinating incident. Can you just describe that?
Sure.
And tell us what you think of it?
Well, and there are other. There are the sinologists, the people who watch this stuff acutely, but I actually think it's almost more telling to have somebody who's just a normal we're all whatever, just looking at this without all of the trappings of expertise.
Yeah.
That was, as the kids say, a boss move, right? Who knows exactly what happened? The most credible story that I've heard is that Xi Jinping basically had arranged it maybe by surprise or kind of at the last minute, probably more the latter by surprise or former by surprise, that the standing committee, so the inner sanctum of the Chinese Communist Party, which is the standing committee of the Politburo, I think, et cetera, or whatever, but it's seven people. That was going to be all Xi Jinping's guys, and it was not going to include Hu Jintao's protege. So Hu Jintao is, of course, the predecessor of Xi Jinping, followed Jiang Zemin, followed the rules of the 10-year term, continued this sort of, we're going to grow and take advantage of the Americans, but we're not going to overly provoke them. Xi Jinping has broken with that. Apparently, there was some sense that maybe Hu was going to cause a ruckus at the opening of the party congress. So literally at the opening of the party congress, they're seated there. It's the most important thing to happen in one of the two most important countries in this decade. And they're like, we're going to escort this old man in a humiliating way out. And Xi Jinping doesn't even have the decency on the point, or he doesn't even have the respect, I would say, to get up and escort him out in a sort of, you could imagine a sort of a graceful, this is my predecessor, he's not feeling well, thank you. No, that's not what happened. Looking forward, everybody else is kind of frozen. And it's like, to me, it's like, we can talk about Chinese politics, but animals would understand what was going on there in my sense.
Amazing. And so that was a real assertion of his power. But are there any rumblings? How does that even work? You're saying he's put his people, and he's got a grip of all the institutions, the army, and so on. I'm assuming. he knows how to control. But I mean, are there rumblings that actually that they could get fed up with him and sort of suddenly it could all collapse? Is that even possible?
I think it's possible. I mean, it's possible. It's possible. He, being a ruthless person, is clearly going to guard against that. I think in a situation like this, loyalty is a very flexible thing. I mean, if you look back at the behavior, say, of the people around Joseph Stalin, I mean, who were putatively loyal to him, in fact, slavishly loyal to him, when it actually came and he was weak and sick, it looks like they put a pillow over his head, over his face, right? Including Beria, who was like the most, and Malenkov, these guys. Mm-hmm. So, yes, these are Xi Jinping's guys. Yes, they're loyal to him, but that's always probably instrumental in a group like this. And I mean, there's an expression I know you spent time there too, but there's an expression in China that I heard that there's sometimes you go to these conferences or whatever in these nice hotels and there's a chandelier, and so the expression is that there's always an anaconda wrapped around the chandelier in China. And that's sort of yes. The vibe. I think it's like these people are always skiing right at the precipice of a cliff. And so, yes, but you've that a move against him. If you're going to kill the king, you better kill him. And so yeah, I think I think what could unseat him is significant economic failure, or possibly, obviously a confrontation with the United States that failed, something like that.
Yes. Do you? I want to get to. Well, let's do that first, and I want to make an analogy with get to the sort of differences and similarities with Putin and Russia and Ukraine. But on the confrontation with the US that failed, do you think that what's happened with this kind of in the last couple of months has made? This is when I remember when we first met and talked. It was over the threat to Taiwan, and your book, and how we should be dealing with that and preparing for that. Do you think that what's happened lately has made the invasion of Taiwan more or less likely, or no real difference? I think it's probably a wash, but too soon to tell. I think it's possible that internal problems could impel Xi to want to look to distract, but I don't think that would be the primary driver because the risks are so high. And, if you look again historically in this kind of context, Khrushchev fell because he took on the Cuban Missile Crisis, and he was regarded as failed. That was one of the reasons that his partners in the Politburo pulled him down. So I think the bigger drivers there, are how capable China feels it is. If Xi Jinping gets to a point in a few years where he's even more confident on the ability to pull it off, and he maybe thinks that the situation could deteriorate economically, I think that could be more likely. But I think it's at this point, I don't think it's probably going to be a main driver of that decision at this stage. Yeah, I think it was Kevin Rudd, the former Australian Prime Minister. I think he had a book out lately, and he was talking about that. And I think he had a kind of his best guess was that if it was going to happen, it would be the kind of the early years of the next decade. He was sort of suggesting that. I can't remember his rationale now. It's funny. I need to follow that. Rudd's an interesting character because he was quite pro-China early on. He's become a lot firmer on it, which is, I think, reality and to his credit. He's actually, he's been quite pointed that they are serious about this and they're not going to wait forever. It's interesting. He's one of the few voices that I've seen actually identify the early 2030s. What you tend to see more in the defense world and military planners is later this decade because the Chinese military will probably be in it'll be a lot of the new stuff for the United States will come into play. So right. I'm not sure. Rudd may be thinking more about some of the political clock and the 5-year Congress. That's, I think, the stuff that he focuses more on. But I should dig into that. Fascinating. Let's so quickly on the Russia comparison, because it just reminds me, we have the same conversations about Russia and Ukraine and Putin, which is, who's going to stop Putin? Is it going to be this massive miscalculation of Ukraine and his inner circle will turn against him? And, when you have these dictators with this incredible power over the apparatus of power, that's what it comes down to, is sort of speculating about the internal threats. Is there anything what do you, obviously, there's no comparison between the Russian and Chinese economy and all the rest of it. But do you think that he could miscalculate Xi Jinping could miscalculate on the scale that Putin has, obviously, with Ukraine? Yes, although I think he's
he's far from an idiot, so he's probably going to take this lesson. And I will say Putin has been the supreme leader in Russia for 20 plus years now. She is, yes, 10 years, but it was a collective leadership model. But I mean, even generously, he's halfway there. I think there's still more. I mean, I think that's a concern, certainly going forward. But I think there's probably more sort of inputs that are reasonably accurate getting to Xi Jinping than we're getting to Vladimir Putin, especially. I mean, the Chinese were crazy on COVID lockdown too, but Putin was like completely isolated. But I think this is definitely one of the features of these authoritarian systems where you get yes men. I mean, I was struck. I think I appreciate this. Like I read a book years ago on the KGB Western intelligence war in the sort of third world in the 70s and 80s. And it was sort of striking, like they kind of cleaned our clock in the sort of espionage world. But the actual information that made it up to the Politburo was often like crazy. Right. It was like so warped by bureaucratic and ideology and just there's no external checks on this stuff that like, even though, our people would get probably better analysis of information and real accurate information than the Soviet leadership did.
By the way, it just reminds me, if anyone, did you watch Death of Stalin, that movie?
Oh yeah.
It's an amazing movie,
yeah,
and I don't know how much of it is fiction or whatever. But I mean, one of the features is the sort of absolute craziness,
right?
Like making things up and finding doctors that will say the right thing, and it's a feature of those regimes. Now, I want to talk about Apple and specifically, and America generally, in the context of this, latest, round of events that makes us focus on China and our China policy. So the specific thing, you touched on it earlier, tell us what you think of this Apple move of disabling the feature that was helping some of these protesters organize the airdrop system, which has just come to light in the last couple of days.
Well, I mean, others know more about the technicalities of it, but I think it looks pretty disgraceful. I mean, in the sense that, especially for a company that's always it's like, right, the 1984 company, the 1984 ad, with the hammer, right? Was that Apple? Oh, is this the company that's literally, running the engine of the Panopticon? I mean, is that what's happening here? And then, of course, at the same time, threatening to kick Twitter off the App Store, which is sort of, it's so beyond parody. It's not even funny because it's so serious, but it's like darkly, I mean, it's kind of Death of Stalin level black humor that you're like preening moralistically in the United States and all this woke stuff. And then, you're just, yes, sir, to the CCP. And I mean, it seems material, and the Chinese take it seriously. I mean, I'm very focused on the military balance because I think at the end of the day, the Chinese are going to have to use military force to bring other countries to heel. But, the Chinese really believe in political warfare and sort of, I don't want to mind control, kind of those, silver helmet sort of thing, but trying to shape people's understanding of what is reality and what's permissible. And if you have the world's largest company and its largest technology company working for you, I mean, that tells you so much about the leverage they have. Yeah. That they will be compliant.
Do you think there's any, and I want to end with the military posture and so on, and what we should be doing from a policy level on that here in America. Yeah. But on this particular issue, do you think that there's an area there for policy intervention from the U.S. authorities in any way to say, sorry, this is not okay for an American company that benefits from all the freedoms and so on that America provides, to be supporting this kind of totalitarian action?
Absolutely. I mean, I don't think this can I think we're beyond the point where we can merely rely on sort of external pressure and condemnation to get these companies to do the right thing. They need to see real concrete incentives. And I think what Governor DeSantis said, I know Senator Hawley's written a letter, as well, like we should be, and these companies have huge, state-backed or enabled bases for their profitability, the Section 230 stuff. I mean, I'm not the world's expert on this, but I think that should all be on the table. And I mean, we are now in a situation where there is a real chance of a conflict. And of course, they're brutalizing their own people and running these crazy COVID policies. But I think, that should certainly be on. I don't know exactly what the right formulation is, but I think there should be accountability, and countries should and companies should be clearly and properly incentivized. I mean, I was disturbed today the Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo was like, "Oh, we're not going to decouple," and it's like, okay, we're not going to do yes, it's not going to go one day to the next, but we should be sending a signal to our companies that there's a one-way street, and they're expected to be diversifying and at least friendshoring, but certainly as much as possible reshoring. Yes. Instead of saying, "Hey, don't worry about it," and then if you lead a delegation of Wall Street CEOs to Hong Kong, we'll just kind of let it slide, no big deal. If you're Tim Cook, no big deal. That's not the signal that our political system and legal system should be sending. Yes.
Well, just to give everyone if you're listening to this on Friday, December the 2nd or Saturday the 3rd, I can give you a sneak preview that we will be having this conversation on my Fox News show on Sunday night. Elbridge will be joining us then as well, because I'm very, very focused on it, and I think it's incredibly important. Let's sort of end with the military situation then. So just bring us up to date there. You said, we could be heading for conflict. Are we preparing the right way?
I think the answer is no. I think the China Military Power Report, this is an annual report that comes out from the Pentagon, just came out this past week, I think on Tuesday. Pretty much more of the same. I mean, now it's become sort of unremarkable. Major nuclear buildup. They've gone faster than we anticipated last year. Global ambitions. You look at the number of countries that they're looking to build bases in. It's staggering. Middle East, Africa, et cetera. Making progress on their military capability. I try to remain, kind of humble in the ability or pretension to predict exactly when it would happen, because my own personal gut sense is that Xi Jingping has not decided either to do it or that there's a particular time certain he's going to do it. But the way I look at it is if he thinks he can do it effectively and at a reasonable cost, and if the alternatives are worse for him, that's going to be a very dangerous situation. I think the administration now is saying, well, it's not imminent, which is okay, well, are they saying it could happen in 6 months, but not 3 months? That's not very reassuring. You see other people saying it won't happen in the next 2 years, but from a defense planning point of view, that's like a blink of an eye. If you're going to really move, and you see the difficulties we're having supplying the Ukrainians, and the Ukraine war would be a tiny fraction or an order of magnitude smaller than a war, God forbid, with China. Is the urgency happening? No. And this is what drives me crazy, Steve. And I honestly just can't wrap my head around it. So you've got people like Jake Sullivan saying there's a distinct threat of an invasion over Taiwan. He said that to David Rubenstein a couple months ago. You have Tony Blinken saying they've moved the timeline, that Beijing has moved the timeline to the left on unification of Taiwan. You say all the serious sources saying China's the major threat, our military advantage is deteriorating, et cetera. And then I'm thinking to myself, and we've got problems with the defense industrial base and, et cetera, and our readiness is low. And I think to myself, and the Taiwanese are not doing their part. I think to myself, okay, well, so what you're saying is there's a pretty good chance that we could get into World War III, and there's also a pretty good chance that we could lose. So wouldn't you be behaving in a different way about that? Wouldn't that be hey, everybody, time out. We're going to send a bill to Congress that has the money, and it's going to specifically go for this. We're going to waive all of the restrictions on protecting the, Guam spotted wildflower because we can't build on it. We're going to, we're going to properly incentivize not just the big defense companies, but a lot of the companies to resuscitate our defense industrial base. We're going to really put the heat on our allies to step up. Is any of that happening? No. It's kind of pretty much we're talking about it. We're moving in the right direction. We're high-fiving with our allies, but it's kind of business as usual. And that is sort of it's kind of like somebody just got a cancer diagnosis and is now I'm going to take a multivitamin or something like that, or I'm going to wear more sunscreen. It's well, maybe you want to do chemo and I don't know, whatever experimental, right? Everything stops, right? And that's not what we're seeing.
As I said, do you think that the Ukraine experience, what's been going on with the Ukraine over the last year or so, has diverted materially, in a way that is materially damaging, resources, whether that's financial or kind of just, attention from what we should be doing to prepare for the situation with China?
Honestly, I think without question. I mean, certainly the level of attention and genuine prioritization, what's on the political agenda. The administration talks about China, and frankly, there are not a lot of Republicans as well who are guilty of this, I would say. They talk about China, but in practice, the behavior doesn't change. And look, I'm all for helping the Ukrainians, but there's a limited amount of money we've been sending in. I mean, the money that we've given to Ukraine would make a huge difference in our Pacific posture.
Yeah.
Or dealing with some of these defense industrial based things. So it's not that Ukraine is the only problem, but it's like everything else is a problem compared to this, right? It's like, so we should be genuinely prioritizing it. And I mean, I think it's pretty obvious that the administration talks about China, but the revealed priority is Ukraine. Look at the way John Kirby talks about Ukraine, the moral fervor and urgency and seriousness versus how he talked about the protests in China. And okay, the other arguments, whatever, but give me a break. We want to cooperate on climate and blah, blah, blah. It's like, no. So I think, look, and the threat from China is an order of magnitude greater. It's very urgent. We're dealing with a guy who is definitely in earnest, it looks to me, like in Xi Jingping. Vladimir Putin is an evil guy. I think that's pretty clear, but he's failing. So I don't even understand why we're focusing so much on Ukraine. Because again, we should help the Ukrainians, but the Europeans can totally step up and take the lead. Exactly right. And we're taking the oxygen out of the room by exercising this leadership. Everybody's like, oh, the Americans are back. It's the good old days. That can't last. It cannot last. And if we're not prepared, it's going to be bad for everybody, including the Europeans.
What would be the kind of, what would you spend the money on? I know that's a sort of simplistic way of putting it, but like the Pacific posture, what needs to happen?
Well, I think there's a little bit of a two stage, because we've got a near-term problem, which is that Xi Jinping might decide to do something in the next kind of 5 years. And there's limits to what we can do in terms of like heavy metal movement in that time frame. And then there's a long-term problem, going out. So, I mean, I think, look, Congressman Mike Gallagher has a good way of talking about it. It's like the anti-Navy. Let's really focus on the problem in the near term. If we can sink the Chinese Navy and shoot down their Air Force that's attacking Taiwan or potentially other, Okinawa, Philippines, et cetera, in the near term, that'll be good enough. And that's a lot about missiles, what C4ISR, basically command and control, sort of sensing, basically the battle network stuff, diversifying that space, these kinds of things. And then our posture. And at the end of the day, there's this idea that, everything's so different, cyber, zeros and ones. No, actually, you still need gas for airplanes to fly. People need to shoot things. They don't go like orders of magnitude longer than they did even in World War II. I mean, I don't want to exaggerate. But, we need stuff there. We need it defended. We need to be hardened. We need our bases to be in good shape. Mm-hmm. That's the kind of stuff. And then getting our allies to do a lot. That's the kind of stuff. If we can really get in that in the near term, we can kind of put the bandage on the wound and then maybe do the surgery, and mixing metaphors a little bit, to kind of fix the deeper issue over time.
Are there people in the Defense Department that want to do this, but it's the political people that are stopping them?
Yes, I think so. So I think what's weird is there are people, there are definitely people, including people in the administration, who want to do this. I think the biggest problem is there is some kind of mental or political constraint on what is on the table in terms of the level of effort and degree of urgency and change that is permissible, that's in the Overton window. Like, to me, if I were there and I had carte blanche, I would be like, how much do we need to spend? And I don't want to spend money on defense. It's crazy that we're spending so much money on defense and we have this problem. But I'd rather spend more on defense than lose a war, or start a war. And I would say, what are the authorities I need? And what do I need to tell these other guys? And I just don't see that happening. Mm-hmm. And so I think people, it's actually interesting. Not to be self-referential, but I say these kinds of things. And often I'll get people at the staff level or younger people being like, you're right, but they can't, their bosses don't believe it. And it's often like an age function. And this gets back to my sort of theory, which is that older people don't appreciate how far China has come and how fast it has come that far.
Right.
Mouse suits and bicycles to hypersonics and AI.
Yeah. Amazing. A couple of times you've mentioned the defense industrial base and so on. Just talk about that a little bit, and probably you have to sort of end on this, because it's interesting. A lot of people, and you see it more and more on the right, actually, are very skeptical about the military industrial complex and, all that kind of stuff, and going on about the corruption there and so on. What's your take on all of that? And what do you mean when you say we have to kind of strengthen that?
Yeah, well, it's a pretty basic point. We just lack the capacity to produce weapons, missiles, platforms, planes, ships quickly and en masse, in 1940.
America.
In America. In 1941, before December 7th, the United States was undertaking a massive military mobilization, but we're using Ford Motor Company and blah, blah, blah. And we were producing already, hundreds of ships, thousands and thousands of aircraft, artillery, tanks, et cetera. We were the arsenal of democracy. That's kind of, unfortunately, China now. And we can't allow that. So the way I look at it is like, here's the national need. We cannot rely on China to build the weapons we're going to fight them with. And really, we can't. We can work with our allies, but we need to have a massive industrial capacity here. And that's sort of like, that's the main point that I want to make.
Don't we have that now? Like when people hear all these companies like Northrop Grumman and Lockheed Martin and Boeing and whatever, they're American companies. Are you saying they don't make the stuff?
Well, they do, but basically the system, since the end of the Cold War, there's been consolidation of the industry for a variety of reasons. And now, and the demand signal was much less, so they produce things sort of in a more boutique and slower fashion. So I'm actually quite sympathetic to the skepticism about the military-industrial complex. What we would not want is to spend a lot of money on defense and then have it be just basically go to shareholders. I mean, people should make money for doing services and so forth. But I think this is actually something that could dovetail with a smart populist agenda, which is to say we need to diversify. There's a whole ton of subcontractors, who are going to be involved here that produce for the primes. You could encourage new entrants. Yes. There's a lot, people like Matt Stoller on the left are thinking really creatively and intelligently about this and about, breaking up some, the role of antitrust. I don't know enough to say, but what I do think is we need to do this, and there's a very legitimate point, so we should take account of it. But we need to do this. We need to be able to build at scale, and we need to design and build it in America. Yeah, absolutely. And it would be good. It would be good. Don't we want more industrial jobs here? Of course, exactly. No, that's great. And that's the sort of exactly the sweet spot, which is to design and make it in America. But that doesn't mean it has to be the exact same structure of companies as we have today and have had for the last few decades. You can make it more interesting. You can bring more competition. But at the end of the day, American companies, American jobs, American defense. Exactly. There you are. Well, we've solved the problem. That's perfect. Well, we've described it. But look forward to seeing you on Sunday. Great. Fantastic. Great to see you as always. And exactly. See you on Sunday. Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Thanks for being with us for this edition of our Friday Conversations. Hope you enjoyed them. If you want more of that, then make sure, of course, you follow us on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. Tell everyone about the show. Spread the word. And we'll see you back here on Monday for the next Daily California.